Open up to the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 7. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. And then he wrote the dream down and related the following summation of it. Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts were coming up from the sea, different from each other. The first was like a lion and had the wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked. It was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one resembling a bear. And it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, Arise, devour much meat. After this I kept looking, and behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet, and it was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. And while I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasting. I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. And his vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was blazing with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. And a river of fire was flowing and coming from before him out. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat, and the books were opened. This is a picture of world history. World history from the first great world empire that took Jerusalem to Rome, the great world empire at the end. But first, we're going to do is I want to get into the nutshell of world history. This is the first part. There's going to be more than one on this, because today we're going to go from a certain point in history up to the destruction of the temple, up to Rome. But this principle is going to take us ultimately, before we finish this series, it's going to take us to the United States of America. This principle is so exact, it's so amazing, that it goes from the time of the pharaohs all the way to 2013. And it explains world history in an amazing way. And the first thing I'm going to do is going to give you a nutshell of ancient history. And then secondly, we're then going to start tying it into things that happen in the Bible linked to that world history. And third, after that, then we're going to get into this secret or key of world history that unlocks world history. And so you will be understanding more than of what's going on in the world, more than renowned scholars of the age. See, I can't go through every kingdom in this series, of course. There are many nations and peoples and kingdoms, and many very substantial ones. For instance, China, India, Latin America, all these things. But we're going to follow the center chord of world history, the focus, the vortex of world empires, and see some amazing things. And we're going to see first the sweep. Civilization begins, as we know it, in what is called Mesopotamia. You learned this, some of us in school, called the cradle of civilization, the fertile crescent, because it looks like a crescent. It's the fertile part of the Middle Eastern desert. It surrounds the rivers of the Middle East, and that's where these kingdoms arose. Particularly the land of Iraq, of all places. Beginning in the mountains of Armenia, flowing down to the Persian Gulf. That's where it all pretty much began. Particularly in the south of this region, which was called Sumer. More than any other people, the Sumerians shaped the Mesopotamian civilization. And they were living originally in kind of independent city-states. Around 2000 BC, they united. Writing as we know it came from Sumer. That, in other words, you had hieroglyphics where basically a picture was what it was, but you had now symbols taking over from pictures, which is going to lead to writing. It began in Sumer. About 2150 BC, they come under the leadership of a city named Ur. Does that sound familiar? And Ur, which it just so happened, and this is we've done another thing called the D33, may not get it right, D328, I think, the secret of world history, which also deals with the centrality of God's purpose. Notice Abraham will end up being right in the center of world history. Today, it's more like America, New York, Israel, and other places. That's where always the Jewish people, God keeps them there. But here, Ur of the Chaldees, they drive out foreign invaders, they reunite, and they reunite Sumer and the region called Akkad under their rule. The Sumerian independence is short-lived. Around 2000 BC, they are conquered by the Elamites. About 1900 BC, the Amorites invade. You hear all these people in the Bible. They establish a capital at the village called Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon. And they have a famous king called Hammurabi, the Code of Hammurabi, 1728 to 1686 BC. It reaches its peak around 1900 to 1595 BC. That's the first Babylonian kingdom. Great center of the world, ancient civilization, and that is called in Hebrew Mitzrayim, and it's called in English Egypt. The first or old kingdom, it has three periods. You got the Egypt Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom or Empire. And so it comes around, in the late Middle Kingdom, the pharaohs extended their power to the land of Israel. But around 1750 BC, something happened. They are invaded by a people called the Hyksos. They invaded them. Who were the Hyksos? It's a Greek version of an Egyptian word that literally means foreign rulers. Now, most likely, the Hyksos were actually Semitic people linked to the Jewish people. And they ruled around 1648 to 1540. And so the 1500s, the Egyptians drove them out, and they ushered in the last big empire of Egypt, called the Empire. They reach its peak. It reaches its peak under King or Pharaoh Thutmose III and Ramesses the Great, who you know about. Ramesses built all these things. There's a question about how they linked up with the Exodus. We'll get to that after. And after that big kingdom comes a long decline for Egypt. And by 1200 BC, Egypt is stripped of all its foreign territories. And it becomes pretty much isolated in many ways to the Nile. Egypt would never again be a great world power after that. And around 1200 comes this invasion across the Middle East called the Sea Peoples. And here these Sea Peoples, some of the Sea Peoples are called the Philistines. They most likely were Greek-based people, and they are sailing, and they're coming by the sea. And they sweep over Egypt. They sweep over this whole region. It's unstable. It's unstable. Egypt deteriorates and continues to deteriorate. Now, another great civilization that arises around the year 1000 BC, around there, is a little kingdom. It really would never have risen up unless there was a big power vacuum. There was a power vacuum. So for a little brief moment, this kingdom rises up in the center of world history, or as even the peak in some ways, and that's called the little kingdom of Israel. And here it is. It's ruled by first a king named Shaul, or Saul, of course, and then David. I mean, it shows you how much there was this big power vacuum when a little shepherd boy could become just about the most powerful man in the world. After the death of Solomon, it splits into two. On the top are the northern 10 tribes. On the south are the southern 2 tribes. Then comes the next great empire. World empire, that's the empire of Ashur or the Assyrians. The Assyrians are another Semitic people. They move into the Mesopotamian Valley, and it's basically they were a huge war machine. They were known for sadistic cruelty. They made them the most feared people, the most hated people of the ancient world. Enemy soldiers were skinned alive, impaled on stakes, or severely mutilated. So were citizens, and entire citizens were slaughtered, or they would mutilate them and put them in cages and bring them to the walls of the city that they were going to attack, and the city would just surrender to them rather than fall into the hands of the Assyrians. Around 883 BC, Ashur-nasir-pal rises in Assyria, and it begins a western conquest. It's as if it was drawn to Israel. All these great powers in some ways are drawn to Israel. It will become the major power of the world around this time. Assyrian Empire reaches its peak under the king named Sargon in 722, and then Sennacherib in 705, and Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. You see all these names in the Bible. They conquered much of the known world back then. Egypt, Phoenicia, everything fell to them. And they're ultimately even going to sweep across Egypt at that time, joining the entire region together. But then comes the next kingdom that rises, and this is where Daniel sees the creatures. The kingdom is again called Babylon. It is in some history books it's called Neo-Babylon. It's the new Babylonian kingdom. It's the revival of Babylon. And so after the death of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian Empire goes into rapid decline. And so here, a Semitic people, the Babylonians or the Chaldeans, they rebel, and they're led by a king whose name is Nabopolassar. He had served the Assyrians as a governor, but now he rises up against them. He senses weakness, and he captures the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. In 612 BC, he destroys it. The new Babylonian Empire rises under King Nabopolassar, and then under his son, who is called Nebuchadnezzar, or you know this in the Bible. This is Nebuchadnezzar, who then joins the Middle East. He sweeps across Egypt, Mesopotamia, becomes the great Babylonian Empire of Daniel. And literally, and it's going to all go with, it's going to be, this is the background to understand the Bible. The next world power that rises up, in Daniel's vision, it was the bear. It rises up in about 559 BC, the prince of this people called Cyrus, or Cyrus, he becomes king of the Persians. And he rises up. Cyrus overthrows the Babylonians about 539 BC, conquers Babylon. Persia, now the great Persian Empire, dominates the ancient world. It's the largest empire ever known, from the Nile to India. When you read about Purim, you read about that at the very beginning, how big this empire was. At its height, I mean, it conquered all these things. And then under Darius, or Darius, it conquers northern Greece. But as it starts coming in contact with Greece, it starts getting drained. And this new empire starts rising a little in Daniel's vision. It is the leopard. It's fast. It's ferocious. It's not big. It's not weighty, rather. It's light, but it's fast. And this is the Greek Empire under Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander the Great. He defeats the Persians, and he sweeps across with his men, sweeps across the Middle East, sweeps across Israel, sweeps across all, even up to around India. When he dies, his kingdom splits, as in Daniel. There are 4 heads that rise up. It splits into 4 kingdoms among his generals. The 2 most prominent kingdoms of these 4 is the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire. And one is Ptolemaic, is Egypt, and the Seleucid is Syria, around there. It's divided up, and now the fact is it's a Greek empire. They seek to make everyone Greek. They seek to be a universal empire that everybody will be drawn into Greek culture. Then comes another, the last of the ancient powers, or the great powers, and of Daniel's creatures. In the 2nd century BC, a new power makes its way known to the west from the Italian peninsula, Rome, expanding under General Pompey, and then the next Julius Caesar. And then after Caesar's death comes a power struggle with Mark Antony, Cleopatra, of the Ptolemaic Empire that we just spoke about, of Alexander, and Octavius, who's adopted as the son of Julius Caesar, adopted son, who will then later become known as Augustus. And he will be hailed as the first emperor of Rome, the new empire. A few decades before the 1st century, Rome becomes the empire of empires. The gospel begins under Rome. It says in the year in which Caesar Augustus reigned, when the birth of Messiah. That is the backdrop. Now that is a sweep. Right now, I just gave you in, I don't know what, 10 minutes, I gave you the whole sweep of ancient history. That's the background of the Bible. But now let's go back and let's kind of lift a veil a little bit to see how what you read in the Bible goes together with what I just said. And then we're going to open up this key of world history. We started with Mesopotamia. Now it's interesting because the Bible starts out with the Garden of Eden. And in Eden, you have 4 rivers. And 2 of those rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. Another one may be the Nile. And so it's interesting that where the Bible says everything started, it's the same place where historians say civilization started. In the same area of the rivers. In fact, Mesopotamia, you know what it means? Mesopotamia, meso means in the middle of, and Potamia, like the Potomac, in Washington, means the river. It means in between the rivers. Which rivers? The same rivers that are mentioned in the Garden of Eden. It all happens around there. And then when you look at Egypt, you have this great center, the Egypt, which is by the Nile, the other river. And we said that around a certain time, 1750, these invaders come in, the Hyksos, which is interesting because when you look at the names of these invaders who took over Egypt for a time, their names are Semitic. Like they have names like Baal, or like one name has Yaakov, like Jacob in it. And so it kind of makes sense that they would be more open to the Hebrews, Joseph, when they came in. But once the Egyptians drove them out, it makes sense that arose the pharaohs who did not know Joseph, who now are against the Hebrews, because the Hebrews are seen as similar to these people. So it makes sense that then they would enslave, or they would come against and fear the Israelites. Then you have the invasion of the sea peoples I talked about as Egypt starts falling apart. And this again was linked to the Philistines, David and Goliath, Samson and Delilah. All that is all part of this backdrop, or all backed up by it. Around 1000 BC, as I said, you have, Israel just comes out of the vacuum, and it's God's plan. It's amazing. They are ruling, and when David and Solomon are ruling, they are at the height of world power. I mean, it's amazing, from nothing to suddenly this height. And it's interesting because if they had stayed following God, if Israel had followed God, the whole history of the world could have been different. I mean, God is sovereign. We're not getting into that. But the fact is that as they started falling away from God, then their enemies started rising up. So the thing is, if they had stayed under God, there's a chance that God would have kept everybody there, because that's what he did at the beginning. But then he allows Assyria to rise up. And yet you could say that all history centers around God, of course, and all history also centers around God's people and God's plan. As they turned away from God, that's when the, quote, the Gentile world kingdoms began to rise and threaten them. And that's what happened. Assyria is the empire of Nineveh. That's Jonah. That's the whole background of Jonah. So when you can understand Jonah a little bit more, it would be like God calling you to go to Nazi Germany that they could get saved. And so if you're Jewish, you went through that, you might not want to do that. So Jonah did not want to go to Nineveh because of how horrible these people were. But he did. the north kingdom, that north kingdom, which is really the backdrop of the harbinger, the north kingdom, Hosea had warned them, Amos had warned them, but by 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire sweeps in and judgment finally falls on them through Assyria. The Assyrians are actually we mentioned this, the Assyrians are the fathers of terrorism. Every terrorist comes in some way, is descended spiritually from the Assyrians. They invented terror as we know it. And they come in and they wipe it away, and then that's where you begin with the 10 lost tribes. They were taken by Assyria. So you see the whole Bible, this goes right in how the Bible goes. Here you have the story of King Hezekiah, and when the Assyrians come to him in the south, in Judah, and they surround Jerusalem, he instead comes to God and says, God, you have to help us. And what happens is that you can understand how fearful they are. With the Assyrians, how awful the Assyrians were, around all the walls of Jerusalem, and the people know if they get in those walls, they are finished. There's going to be horror and terror. So you can understand more what that was like for Hezekiah. He brings it to God and says, God, help us. And what happens? As he does that, it says, the Bible says, and God sent one angel to help. And that angel struck down thousands and thousands, the entire Assyrian army in one night. And the amazing thing is that if you look in history at a map, the Assyrian Empire went all across, but it didn't get Judah. There's something stopped it from getting Judah. And there's actually, I mentioned this, there's actually in a Greek historian, in Greek history, it's kind of like they got something, they got an echo of this, because they wrote about a time when the Assyrian Empire was outside a city, and suddenly it was struck by a plague. But it matches what the Bible says about Israel. Then you have the rise of Babylon we spoke about. How does that link with the Bible? Well, this is the backdrop of Daniel. This is the backdrop of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, that Babylon is rising up, and Jeremiah rises up, and Jeremiah will warn Judah of the judgment coming through Babylon. And he tells the king of Judah, submit to Babylon. But all the false prophets are saying, no, God's going to bless you, prosperity, don't worry about it. And they are all false. The people will reject Jeremiah, but the king will be taken captive to Babylon and blinded, and his sons will be killed. And Babylon will be the kingdom that destroys Judah and Jerusalem and the temple, and brings God's people into captivity. The Babylonian captivity, 70 years, they destroy Israel. When Jeremiah, we believe, who is writing Lamentations, he's weeping over Jerusalem, that's the work of Babylon. So they go, Babylon, as Daniel saw, the lion with wings of an eagle. And then, as we saw, the next power was Persia. So the Bible speaks in Daniel of Persia taking over Babylon. And it's this massive bear. It's massive, it's big, it's cumbersome. And then you have the kingdom, you have Ezra and Nehemiah and Cyrus. That's all under Persia, because the Persian Empire actually did something good. They let the Jewish people return to Israel and rebuild Jerusalem. So they actually blessed Israel. And that's where you have then Esther and Mordecai. And then the Persian Empire almost destroys the Jewish people, but it doesn't happen. Now the Old Testament ends with the Persian Empire. But then, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, you've got the Greeks. And that's where you have Alexander with a leopard with the four heads and the wings. And there you have it. And that's where you have it's the Greek, or the generals of Alexander who make up this new empire, the Syrian Empire or Seleucid Empire. And that's where you get Hanukkah. The background of Hanukkah is the Greek Empire, where they tried to destroy the Jewish faith. And the man who rises up, the Greek king, is Antiochus Epiphanes. He's a foreshadow of the Antichrist. And he's going to fight over, for years, the two kingdoms, the Ptolemies of Alexander in Egypt, and the Syrians with Antiochus, they would fight over Israel. And from the south, the Ptolemies, that you would come, Cleopatra. Cleopatra really wasn't Egyptian. She was Greek. She was a descendant of the general of Alexander's. And so you have this thing, so you have the whole Hanukkah story with the Greeks in back of it. But then the Bible speaks of the fourth kingdom, Rome, the one that is unlike all the other kingdoms. It's more terrible and more mighty than all the others. Iron and clay, it tramples down everything. That's the background of the New Testament. All under Rome. Herod, he's appointed by Rome. And then the Pontius Pilate, appointed by Rome. Herod Agrippa, appointed by Rome. Felix, Festus, Roman names. Until the revolt, the Jewish people have a revolt against Rome in the latter part, just before, a few years before 70 AD. The book of Acts is all Rome. The rest of world history it takes place after it's Rome coming. And so you see God's hand in this and intertwining the history of the world with the history of his people. Now, we're going to uncover now the key. That's going to reveal the story behind the story of the key of world history. And now for that to happen, we need to turn to Genesis. Turn to Genesis chapter 12. We'll look at something, we're going to begin something now that's going to go, ultimately, we will see what's happening in the world right now is exactly tied into what was happening then. Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and go from your father's house, your relatives, to the land I'll show you. And I'll make you a great nation, and I will bless you. And I'll make your name great, so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you. And the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So God takes a man in Babylonia, in Sumer, in Ur of the Chaldeans, and he tells him, I'm going to make you a great nation, and whoever blesses you will be blessed, and whoever curses you will be cursed. Or in other words, the Abrahamic covenant. Now you can take it either in a very small way, in that simply it only means this, I will bless you and I will curse those who curse, or a larger way, that what it's saying is, not only that, but whatever you do to the Jewish people or Israel or Abraham's descendants, it will come back to you. It will be reciprocated back. So if you bless, it comes back as blessing. If you curse, it comes back as cursing. This is true for nations and individuals alike. I have never met a person who hated the Jewish people and prospered, was a blessed person. Never. I've never met a person who loved the Jewish people in God and wasn't blessed in some way. So here we're going to see something, the actual history of the world revolving around this secret. This key, a secret to the world. Egypt, look at Egypt. It rises to the height of its power. The children of Israel are inside of it when it rises. The Egyptian empire. And then they turn against the Jewish people. They strip them of their status. They strip them of their rights. They make them slaves. Their possessions, everything stripped. The Egyptian empire. So what happens to Egypt? Abrahamic covenant. They strip them. They enslave them. Egypt, from the height of world power, Egypt collapses. It enters a long period of decline. You can almost take it as the Pharaoh is heading to the Red Sea and the Red Sea sweeps his army. That's the beginning of the end. Egypt enters a long period of decline as Egypt stripped the children of Israel of its possessions and status as a people. One historian writes, Egypt was stripped of all its territories. Egypt was stripped continuously. It went into a long decline until it became a second-rate power, a vestige, a shadow of its former self. The famous poet Shelley wrote a famous poem in 1817 concerning a man called Ozymandias. Ozymandias was referring to Ramses the Great, the Pharaoh, and who was around the time of the Exodus somewhere, the last great Egyptian Pharaoh who built monuments to himself all over. And Shelley wrote this. He said, I met a man from an antique land who said, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survived stamped on those lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing besides remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. Boundless and bare, the lone and level sand stretched far away. This is taught in English classes throughout the world. But it was about the collapse of Egypt and the fall of man. And when did that fall happen of Egypt? It all happened just around the time of the Exodus. Egypt comes against the God of Israel, comes against the children of Abraham, and the hand of God comes against Egypt. Judgment comes as the children of Israel were stripped and debased. The Egyptian empire is stripped and debased. As the possessions were taken of Israel, the possessions of Egypt are taken. Egypt would be continually debased and spoiled and pillaged and used by other nations, literally become a slave of other nations as they had enslaved Israel. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. The Assyrian Empire, one of the most brutal empires in history. As we said, and the Assyrian policy was when you conquer a land, you take everybody out and mix in everybody so nobody's going to rise up against you. You end their identity. That's what they did with the 10 lost tribes. And so there they do this. The Assyrians, the most ferocious people, they were brutal with Israel. They brutally destroyed the northern kingdom, razed it to the ground, massacred its people, ended their identity. So that Israel, the northern tribes, is a lost thing. 10 lost tribes, nobody knows. So what would that mean according to the Abrahamic covenant of history? As the Assyrians brutally attacked Israel, it would mean that they themselves would be brutally attacked. As they razed Israel to the ground, it would mean that they would be razed to the ground. As they massacred and carried away its people, it would mean they would be massacred and carried away. And as they ended the history of the northern kingdom, it meant that the history of Assyria would be ended. So what happened? In the year 612 BC, a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and Persians and others rose up against Assyria. They attacked it with fury. The prophet Nahum said they would be drunk in their final hours, and they would be entangled among it. And according to the historians, they literally were drunk when the attack came. Nahum 3:15, the prophet said that Nineveh would be damaged by fire, as Israel was. The fire will devour you, it says. The sword will cut you down. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, archaeologists have uncovered Assyria. They found a layer of ash. It was burned to the ground. Nahum says, the Lord has given a command concerning you, Nineveh. You will have no descendants to bear your name. I will destroy your carved image. In other words, there's going to be nothing left. When Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BC, it marked the absolute end of the Assyrian Empire. The city would never rise again. Today, Nineveh is an archaeological ruin in Iraq. Assyria cut off the northern kingdom. God cut off Assyria. Exactly what happened. In Nahum 3, it says, nothing will heal or can heal your wound. Your injury is fatal. And everyone who hears the news about you claps his hands at your fall. For who has not felt your endless cruelty? As Assyria made Israel into a desolation, ruins, so it says that he will make Nineveh a desolation. And now for years there were many scholars who didn't believe exactly what the Bible said. The reason was there was no trace of Assyria, of the Nineveh, no trace at all. And the reason why there was no trace, they couldn't find any trace of the city. The reason was it was so destroyed that you couldn't even find it. When Alexander passed by the city, he didn't even know the city, that was Nineveh. The only thing that was left is a series of mounds in Iraq. That's it now. Assyria had brutally crushed Israel. Assyria was brutally crushed. Assyria massacred them, brutally massacred. Assyria ended Israel's history, the northern kingdom. They were ended forever and razed to the ground. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. Babylon was not as brutal as Assyria, but they were real brutal anyway. They weren't that nice to begin with. They took over Israel. They absorbed Israel into their empire, had them pay tribute as a subject people. But as Judah rebelled against them, Babylon came in and they destroyed the city of Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple, destroyed the city, destroyed the land. Then they did something else that deeply affected Jewish history. It says they depopulated the city. They took them away. In the book, Jeremiah, we believe, wrote Lamentations. And in Lamentations, you have your Bible, Lamentations 1, he sings his lament over the city. Verse 1, how lonely sits the city that was once full of people. She has become like a widow who was once great among the nations. He's talking about Jerusalem. She who was a princess among the provinces has become a forced laborer. She weeps bitterly in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. She has no one to comfort her. Among her lovers, all her friends have dealt treacherously against her. They become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile, under affliction, under harsh servitude. She dwells among the nations, but she's found no rest. All her pursuers have overtaken her in the midst of distress. The roads of Zion are in mourning because no one comes to the appointed feast. All her gates are desolate. Her priests are groaning. Her virgins are afflicted. She herself is bitter. How lonely sits the city, empty of people, called the Babylonian captivity. Depopulated Israel, depopulated an empty city. So what happens now? If we apply the key of world history to this, should happen to Babylon according to the Abrahamic covenant? The Bible records part of it. It was invaded and taken over by the Persians. And from that time, Babylon became subject to other nations, just like Judah did under Babylon at the beginning. Later, Alexander took it over, but with Alexander's death, Babylon started falling apart. And something interesting happened. One historian says this. It says the constant turmoil emptied out the city of Babylon. Emptied out the city of Babylon. Babylon had emptied out the city of Jerusalem. The Babylon itself was emptied out of people. A tablet dated 275 BC states that the inhabitants of Babylon were transported out of the city, just as the Jewish people were out of Babylon. And with this deportation, the history of Babylon comes to an end. 100 years before Babylon had reached the height of its empire, the prophet Isaiah gives this prophecy. He says, the day of the Lord is at hand. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. I will stir up the Medes against it, and Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans, the pride, they shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It shall never be inhabited. Neither shall the Arab pitch his tent there. Neither shall the shepherds make their flocks lie down there. But wild beasts of the desert shall dwell there. 100 years later, Jeremiah prophesies the same thing. It shall be utterly overthrown. What happened? Babylon was emptied and emptied and emptied. And when archaeologists went back to the city, they found the ruins of the city, and they found that it was just basically a place of jackals. And just the way the Bible said, it would be depopulated, the great Babylon, As you do unto Israel, it will be done to you. Next, the Persian Empire. What did Persia do to Israel? Unlike the others, Persia never really invaded or destroyed the land, never went against the Jewish people with a little exception, never really destroyed it. Persia actually did some good. They allowed Israel to come back and rebuild their kingdom, not as it had been under the glory of the kings. It was on a smaller scale. They allowed it on a smaller scale, but they allowed it to continue on. So what happens to Persia? According to the mystery, or this key, what will happen to Persia will be different from the other kingdoms, because Persia treated Israel different. What it would mean is that God would allow Persia to continue as a kingdom, even rebuild itself, but never as great as it had once been. That's what should happen. Well, what happened to the Persian Empire? What happens to the kingdom of Darius? What happens is the Persians are defeated by the Greeks. But less than a century after its fall, about 80 years later, just like Israel was in 70 years in captivity, 80 years later, a new Persian empire rises up, called the Parthian Empire. And it was actually the Magi were linked to this. And it was not as great as the original Persian Empire, but just as they had allowed Israel, God had allowed Persia to continue. And then again, then that empire fell, and then another Persian empire came up called the Sassanid Empire. And that was about 226 AD. Then Persia falls again. It's never as great as it was, but as it did to Israel, it's allowed to them. Then comes in the 1500s, comes another Persian empire, the Safavid Empire. And again, one of the really great empires, but nothing compared to its original glory. And then it collapses again. And then in the 1730s, another Persian Empire revival happens, and then it declines again. 1925, another Persian monarchy or kingdom rises up. In 1971, the Persian king has a celebration of 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. He saw himself as the heir of Darius and Cyrus. And he sought to restore the glory of Persia again. In 1976, he replaced the lunar Islamic calendar with a solar calendar that began with the Persian Empire. And these actions and others were viewed as un-Islamic, and he was overthrown. It was the 20th century that took Persia and changed its name to Iran. The king who sought to revive the Persian Empire was the Shah of Iran. Persia, to this day, exists. Because they allowed Israel to continue, God allowed Persia to continue. Never never as it was, but to this day, Persia or Iran tries to assert its power and tries to revive itself. And in the process, today, it's become an enemy of Israel, which is not good for Iran. It's amazing how accurate this is. And now we go to the Greek Empire. What did the Greek Empire do to the Jewish people? Well, after Alexander, it appeared, a little bit benign, but the ultimate thing the Greek Empire tried to do was a little different. They tried to instead assimilate the people into Greek culture, into Greek religion, into Greek. It happened by violence under Antiochus Epiphanes, that's Hanukkah. They tried to get the people to worship the gods of the Greeks. They just defiled the temples of Israel. Antiochus, but interesting, right with Antiochus, who tried to wipe out the Jewish faith, guess what happens to the empire? It starts collapsing. At the end of his reign, it's collapsing. Collapsing so much that 100 years later, it's like nothing. Gone. It decays. It's stripped after it tries to do this. But it's deeper than that. Because here is one of the great empires that becomes nothing after they turn against Israel. But the relationship is deeper because the Greek civilization tried to assimilate the people, make them become Greeks. That was what they tried to do, make the faith of Israel disappear and get absorbed by the faith of the Greeks, of the Greek gods. So what's going to happen to the Greeks? Or what's going to happen to Greece according to this ancient Abrahamic covenant? As they sought, think about it, as they sought to assimilate the Jewish people into their own civilization, their own religion, their own worship, what's going to happen is that God is going to absorb the Greeks into his faith. It's true. He's going to use everything Greek to lift up the God of Israel. In fact, he's going to use everything, the Greeks, he's going to use the Greek language to spread the gospel. As they sought to eliminate the worship of the God of Israel, God eliminates the worship of the Greek gods. And as they sought to bring all the Jewish people into the Greek religion, he brings the Greek people into the God of Israel. I mean, it's amazing how God does it. I mean, he uses all these things. The first Gentiles to receive the gospel are called Greeks. It's the Jew and the Gentile, or the Jew and the Greek. In fact, even the names, the diaspora, the Jewish people are scattered. That's a Greek name. And through the scattering of the Jews, this Greek thing, the gospel spreads to the Greeks. And you have another thing called the synagogue. Jewish? No, it's a Greek name. Synagogue is a Greek name. God used the synagogues with a Greek name in the Greek areas to spread the gospel to the Greeks. The Greeks said, hey, we can assimilate these Jews. We will make them Hellenized Jews, they're called. Hellenized, Greek-speaking, cultured Jews of Greece. But God takes one of these Greek-speaking Jews, Saul of Tarsus, named Paul, and he brings the gospel to the Greeks. The Abrahamic covenant. As you do to Israel, it shall be done to you. And the last great empire, I mean, there's so much here. The last great empire of the ancient world. It could be called the archetypical empire of empires. Rome. What did Rome do to Israel? Rome subdued Israel. Rome oppressed Israel. Rome taxed and drained Israel. Rome pushed its culture over Israel. Rome showed little respect for the faith of Israel. But Rome ultimately invaded Israel and destroyed Israel and scattered Israel across the face of the earth. The fact that there are Jewish people in America is from Rome. They scattered them. They broke up the kingdom, scattered, spread Israel throughout the world, the diaspora. But here is this last mystery of the ancient kingdoms. Number one, Rome oppressed and drained and taxed and occupied Israel. And the Romans were to the Jewish people were as barbarians ruling over them. What happened to Rome? They would become increasingly an oppressed civilization. They would be drained. They would be taxed to death. They would ultimately contribute to its fall. They would be ultimately taken over by those they consider to be barbarians. Secondly, as Rome caused Jerusalem to fall, God would cause Rome to fall. Not, and the first thing that what's fall, first it got cut in two, and then it got pillaged and plundered. As Rome showed no reverence to Israel's faith and often committed sacrilege, God would end the faith of Rome. By this irony, they would end up abandoning the gods of Rome, as with Greeks, and they would accept, at least on the surface, the God of Israel. The Roman, here, think about this. Rome would crucify the Jewish king, Messiah, in the name of the Roman king, Caesar. But in the end, the Roman king would end up bowing his knees to the Jewish king, Messiah, Jesus, Yeshua. That's the irony of God. And Rome would come to accept the God of Israel, but then Rome would do something that no other kingdom had done. It would completely fragment, break apart, spread across the earth, the Jewish people, Israel, across the earth. To this day, that we have Jewish people around the world. What does that mean according to the key of history? It means that as Rome broke up Israel, spread it all over the world, God will break Rome up in pieces, and he will scatter it throughout the world. Now let me explain. Amazing, because that's exactly what happened. By the 3rd century, Rome was fragmenting in every different way. But then it would be cut in two and then cut in pieces. It would be scattered, taken over. And as time progressed, everything kept fragmenting more and more. The city of Rome, in the middle, would become the Middle Ages. Rome broke Israel into pieces. Rome would be broken again and again into pieces. And so God had it. You had Europe. It was called the Holy Roman Empire. It was broken. You have the language of Rome, Latin. It starts breaking up and starts becoming French and Italian and Spanish and Portuguese and Romanian. It starts breaking up and covering the earth, broken. If the Roman government starts breaking up and spreads to almost every government in the world. The fact that you have duches or dukes and duchesses, that all comes from the Roman. El Duce is from Rome. Even the United States of America is led by a president. The word comes from Rome. The United States is led by a Senate. That comes from Rome. Even the Senate building is modeled after the Pantheon. It's breaking a part of Rome and spreading it all over the world. The Kaiser of Germany was named after the Tsar of Rome, or the Caesar of Rome. The Tsar of Russia was named after the Caesar of Rome. Even the Catholic Church represents the scattered pieces. They divide up the world into dioceses. That's the Roman division of the world. The fact is, Rome still, even the Pope, who's called Pontifex Maximus, that's the title given to Caesar. The fact is, Rome still affects the world in pieces and is being set for the end times. As you do to Israel, it shall be done to you. The Abrahamic covenant. Something also to note. When the Jewish people began returning to the land after 2,000 years, there was again an Israel in the world. Less than 10 years later, the broken pieces of the Roman Empire start coming together. And they sign a treaty called the Treaty of Rome. That's the beginning of the European Union. Now, to bring this to its conclusion, there's so much here. And there will be a sequel that's going to bring it right up to America, what's happening right now. But here's the thing. How amazing is it? God says one thing to this one old Middle Eastern man, and it determines history ever since. Everything from Egypt to the Turkish Empire, the Spanish Empire, the Dutch Empire, the British Empire, Germany, Russia, America, all of it, from the pharaohs to New York City, all from this covenant he gave to Abraham. To bring it home, amazing. What was spoken in Ur has now determined the course of history by the hand of God. 4,000 years ago, and it is held true to this day. What does it tell you? God means business. God, his word is serious. When he says something, take it seriously. When he says something leads to death, it means it leads to death. When he says it leads to life, it leads to life. When he says do this and you'll die, take it seriously. Do this and live, take it seriously. When he says this road leads to hell, take it for real. This road leads to heaven, take it for real. Repent, yes. When he says go left, don't go right. When he says go right, don't go left. He says do not fear, take that seriously too. He says go and proclaim the word, this is my command, you take that seriously and proclaim the word. When he says I'll never leave you, take that seriously too. And the next thing is this. The rising and fallings of kingdoms